This is delaying a triggered event. And the example I'm using is locking a row after some period of time. So previously we've had it set up where we check a box and it locks a row. Now what I want to do is check a box, wait some period of time, 5 seconds, 30 seconds, 5 minutes, 2 weeks, then lock the row. Okay, let's jump in, extensions, app script, and take a look at what we need to do. Since we want this to trigger when I check the box, we're going to use onEdit, run an onEdit function. However, the method that we're going to use to create this is ScriptApp.newTrigger. Whenever you're calling an app, be that any of these, UI app, Gmail app, Drive app, spreadsheet app, Data Studio app, Calendar app, anything, any of these apps, you cannot use a simple trigger to call those. You have to use an install trigger. So instead of onEdit, we're going to call this createTimeLockTrigger. And here in triggers, we're going to add a trigger on edit. And what's important here is those apps need user permissions. It's going to run as someone. In this case, it's going to run as me. Oh, come on. I don't want you to load data. Just run. There we are. So we're going to give it the permissions of me, advanced, and go to untitled project. This allows it to do stuff as me, allow, and that's going to actually create the trigger for createTimeLockTrigger. Now we can actually work with it. Just like any normal onEdit function, I want to declare my constants. I don't even need a source here because I only have one tab. If you have multiple tabs, obviously use source. Const r equals e.range. And all I want to say is if it's not in this checkbox array, checkbox range, don't do anything. If r.rowStart equals 1 or r.columnStart is less than 4, return. That's it. Technically, this allows this entire range, but let's assume it's just the checkboxes we're actually caring about. Now, if that happens, I'm going to use ScriptApp.newTrigger. Let's look at what it needs. It needs a function name as a string passed into it, which we can see down here. So the example one is they're creating a new trigger for the function myFunction on the spreadsheet. This is the spreadsheet ID they're using. You don't have to do that if it's in the same spreadsheet. And they're doing it as an onEdit function. We're going to do ours as a time function. But first we see that we need to create another function that's actually going to do the locking. Function timeLockTrigger. Also note, let's put that in, timeLockTrigger. I don't know how to get back into the helper. Maybe someone knows, and that would be great. I don't know how to get back into here once I've already started using it. But notice here the big challenge we have. There is no parameters passed when you create it as a string. We can't do, timeLockTrigger row. That's not what it's asking for. It's not asking for the function with the brackets, with the parentheses. It's only asking for the function name itself, which means we need to be kind of clever in how to actually pass in the parameters. That's what we're really looking at here. Now, I want to do this as a time-based trigger, which it tells me how to do. We aren't going to pass any parameters there. The parameters come in this part. So it's a time-based trigger, and we want it to run when. You can set recurring ones to run every several minutes, every couple of days, on whatever day of the week, etc. We're going to use after, and let's look at what that's going to give us. It wants a number of milliseconds. Now, careful here, specifies the minimum duration after the current time that the trigger runs. The actual duration might vary, but won't be less than your specified minimum. I don't know what all the requirements and restrictions are here. All I know is if we cannot be too specific on when you want this to run. If you say run in 5 minutes, it will run in at least 5 minutes, not exactly 5 minutes. So that we can run this through kind of quickly, I'm going to put this to 2000 milliseconds, which is 2 seconds. And I'm going to finish that with .create. If I don't use .create, we actually miss it because it's like filling out a form and then not clicking submit. You did all of the work, but you didn't actually create it. You didn't actually submit it. So create is what's actually going to do that for us. We can see it working already because I have my trigger set up for createTimeLockTrigger right there. So if I come here and let's click D4, then up here in executions, it shows that it ran. And if I come to triggers again, then there's a new trigger set up for timeLockTrigger set to run at 5:03. So that should actually run any second now. Maybe it already ran. No, not quite yet. That's fine. We'll get back to that. But we can see at least that it is working, right? It did create the trigger, which is the first important thing for it to do. Now, I need to get the parameters, which in this case, the only parameter I care about is the row that we edited. But I need to get that row into timeLockTrigger so it can actually work. All right? So let's first create a variable for this trigger. Let's just call it trigger. Reason I'm going to do that is the way we're going to pass parameters to timeLockTrigger is by use of the properties service, which stores data over periods of time in the backend. Get script properties so that way it's tied to the script. And I'm going to set a property. The property, I really wish this would stay scrolled down. Set property. All right, what property is going to take is 2 strings, a key and a value. This is called a key value pair. Their example is they created a property called nickname, and the value is Bobby. What we're going to want to pass in as our value is r.rowStart. We want to know what row was edited. What we're going to use as the key is trigger.getUniqueId. That way, in the properties service, the row is associated with the unique ID of this trigger, which we can access later. It's great. One important thing to note, looking back, if we remember the parameters that setProperty wants, it's 2 strings. We're passing in a row, but that row is going to go in as a string. We'll look at that in a moment. timeLockTrigger. Now I want to pass into this a parameter argument called trigger event, and that's going to store everything about the trigger, same as this E does here for my onEdit trigger. So it would normally hold things like the value and the range and stuff like that. Okay. What we can use though is an object called trigger.UID. So that's trigger event dot trigger UID. That's not a method. That's just what that's called. It's one of the objects. It's like e.range. We're doing event trigger dot trigger UID. And to get that out of the property service, we're going to do property service dot get script properties dot get property. The key we're going to get is trigger event dot trigger UID, which should match with the unique ID of the trigger created. Right? We don't need to say anything else because it takes the key and gives us back the value. Like we said, if we're doing row start, that's being passed in as a string. I need to get that back into a number. We use parseInt. Okay. I want to use that in a separate place, so I want to do let row equals. So the row is going to be the value in properties service associated with the key trigger event.triggerUID, and I'm going to convert that into a number, which then lets me do spreadsheet app.getActiveSheet.getRange. Row is going to be just the row. Column is column 1. Number of rows 1. Number of columns. Like here we had 9 columns. And I'm just going to do .protect. I'm not going to worry about actually adding or removing editors to this. Other videos have shown how to do that. All we're doing is proofing out the methodology of using the properties service and ScriptApp.newTrigger to create triggers that work in the future. So let's take a look and check that this whole thing works. One thing to note before we get there, this trigger has now run, lock time trigger, and then it goes to disabled. It says the trigger has expired. This means that the trigger was only meant to fire once and upon completion was disabled. That's exactly what we want. It ran once, it goes away. After some period of time, that will actually go away. It'll leave this whole area. I'm not sure how long that time is. So we can see that timeLockTrigger did run. Wouldn't tell it to do anything, but it did run. Now, if we check, let's say F7. Come up here, create timeLockTrigger. That ran, which should create a new trigger for us. Perfect. There's my new trigger. When's that going to run for us? At 5:10, which right now it's almost there. So let's just give it a few seconds, and then we'll go check to see what it actually created. Well, actually, we can look what it created right now, because in project settings, it tells us script properties. So here's the ID associated with the trigger that just ran, or the trigger that was just created, and the value associated with that property. So row 7 is exactly where we wanted it, and it's associated with that trigger ID. So just a couple of seconds, and then we should see this come up. Perfect. There it's running right now. So if we come back to the sheet and go to data, protect, excellent. It did exactly what we wanted. It protected A7 to I7, so it protected the entire range after a few seconds, or in this case, about a minute and a half had occurred, because this ran at 5:08 and this ran at 5:10. So yeah, about a minute and a half is what we had. It works. It did exactly what we want. The one thing I do want to do is some cleanup, because the script property is still here, and I don't want to just keep creating more and more and more of these. So I'm going to add one extra piece, and that says PropertiesService.getScriptProperties.deleteProperty. Trigger event dot trigger new ID. Now it's going to create the trigger, run the function, lock the range, and delete the property at the end, so we don't just keep getting more and more and more of those. Let's check that one more time. Let's do E9. Come back here, executions. Create timeLockTrigger ran. If we come to triggers, there's a new trigger made. Both of the previous runs are disabled. We added this to look 7:14, 5:14. So this one we actually have, yeah, again, about a minute and a half is what we're looking at. I'm going to go ahead and we're going to pause the recording so we don't have to wait that minute and a half for nothing. If we come down here, here's the new property that was made, and now we can see when it does run, that is going to delete it. So I'm going to go ahead and pause this, and in a moment restart it, and we can see that it worked. It is now 5:15. Give it a little bit more just to make sure it ran correctly. Let's check first the executions. timeLockTrigger ran. Come back to the triggers. It is now disabled. Come back to the data. The range is now protected. And if we go back to project settings and down to the properties, that property we just looked at is gone. It deleted itself. The old one's here because we didn't have it set to delete at the time. I'll just go ahead and clear that out manually. But like I said, once we know the process, it's a pretty straightforward process. It just involves this extra time with the property service. So we create a trigger. We actually give it a variable so that we can get the unique ID out of it. Technically, we could get that straight out of here, get unique ID, but this feels like a solid enough thing. I'm going to leave it as is. We set into the property service as key the unique ID of the trigger and as value any parameters. If we did need to have more parameters here, say the value of the edit, an email address associated with it, whatever, we would need to do that in an array and then stringify that array and put that in. That would look like let data equals 1, 2, 3. And then we do JSON.stringify to turn that into data, that a string that the property service can easily use. We don't need to use that here because in my example, it's just the row that I care about. In the actual function being called, we're going to parse the int. ParseInt is parse integer. So turn that string into an integer so that we can protect that range, and then we delete the trigger ID. That's it. And this can be used for any trigger out there in order to delay the time between the time it is triggered and the time that it actually happens. You can set that to seconds, minutes, days, weeks, whatever you need out there.
Thank you so much for watching. I hope this helped. Please like, subscribe, share, all the normal things. You can connect with me at these addresses below, and I do try to stay up to date and commenting and interacting on the comment section.